Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Denise Charleton and I'm going to be chairing the session this afternoon from Slowbalisation to a Cashless society. And somebody earlier asked me, what did that mean? And I said it means that the speakers can say whatever they like, really. But I have had the pleasure of talking to all the speakers a little bit about what they're going to communicate and chat about this afternoon, and I think it'll be a brilliant session. So obviously there are external trends that affect the work that we all do all the time. As a very busy sector, we often don't get the time to lift the heads up to really think about those trends and the impact that they have on the immediate work and the longer term work. So this afternoon is a chance to do that with this fantastic panel. So I'm going to introduce them one by one. They're going to speak for 10 minutes approximately. I'm going to give them a 2-minute warning. Anyone who goes over, I start to sing a slow ballad called Grace. It has a number of versions to it, a lot of verses, and I sing it very badly. So I hope that they won't force you to listen to my singing and that they'll all conclude their comments when they get their 2-minute warning. So we're going to start. You have their biogs in the brochure, so I'm not going to spend too long on them. But Stefan here to my right works with the European Commission, and he's an economist, sociologist, an author. One of his books, What's Europe For Anyway? So you're getting a little sense of what he might share with us, trends in Europe. Averil Power will be known to many people in the room, if not everybody. Started politics in the student union many years ago. Not so many years ago, sorry. Not so many years ago. Went on to party politics, is now a leader in the sector, previously with the Asthma Society and now with cancer. And I got to know Averil, had the pleasure of working with her during the marriage equality referendum, and she was a key leader on that. Then we have Shana, who is with TASC, the Think Force, vast amount of experience in research and the NGO sector, American context, particular interest in Morocco, UK context, and now Irish context. So we'll be very interested to hear her views on various trends informed by an evidence base and a research base. And then we've left the money man to last. He likes to go last, and I don't know about you, but anybody who has any involvement with investment and money, I'm always dying to hear their contribution. So I'll pass it over now to this great panel, and then we will be passing it over to you guys. I have Averil Power's very fancy watch, which I'm not allowed to go home with, but we will be passing it over to you guys then for comments and observations and questions. Okay, Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very impressed by this event. Not only by the Spice Girls outside, but mostly by the people inside, and like the really big crowd and quite diverse. So it's my first time to Ireland, and the first impression is very, very big, very, very good. Now a word of explanation why I am here and what is the context. I work for DG Employment Social Affairs in unit which deals with coordination of social aspects of European semester. European semester is a means of EU, the Commission, but also other member states looking at each other, monitoring the economic and social situation in all 28 countries, and telling each other what should be done. So it is very soft policy instrument. It's not binding, but every year we, the Commission, prepare a report on economic and social developments in every member state. Based on this, we suggest recommendations for the next year, what should be done. Those recommendations are discussed by all member states, and the member states, then the Council issues those recommendations. And the following year, we have a look at what has been done and what should be done to make economic and social situation in those in Europe in a given member state better. As you have heard in the opening session, socially it's back in Europe. So our main job is to make sure that this little blue booklet, which is European Pillar of Social Rights, is implemented also thanks to the recommendations in the European semester process. And in the unit which coordinates social and employment aspects of European semester, I am responsible for contacts for outreach to civil society. So this is, like why I'm here and why it is me who will be allowed to say whatever I please in the next 7 minutes. I understand that like the slowbalisation, I had to Google the term, and cashless society are the big trends which do you think it's reasonable to take into consideration, into account when planning your strategy for next years. So what I'm going to share with you are the 3 main trends which we in the European Commission believe are going to shape our immediate and not so immediate future, and which for sure are going to have a big impact also on how the charities operate. Even though, as you will see, we don't necessarily know in detail what will happen. Those 3 trends are demographic change, technological change, and climate change. You can call it also like in other terms, demographic aging, future of work, global warming. And those 3 issues I mentioned in the order of certainty. And demographic aging, we know basically very much. So demography is quite easy to predict. We know how many people are going to be over 65 in 20 years' time, because all those people are 45 now. Yeah? So the big, the trends of what is waiting our for what our societies will experience are already all there. So with a perspective up to 2070, 2080. So also, as you have seen in the plenary session this morning, in the next 10 years in Ireland, the number of people over 65 years of age is going to significantly increase. Ireland is not the only country in the Union which is going to experience this kind of development. Within the next 5 years, so within the term of the next Commission, which I hope you will all help to elect tomorrow, there will be 11 countries in which the share of working age population will decrease by more than 3 percentage points. This is a massive development, which means that which has consequences both at the side of the output of economy, so fewer people in the working age, meaning they need to be more productive to produce the same amount of GDP, goods and services, but also at the side of demand for social services, for notably the so-called silver economy, so like all kind of support for elderly, whom we still define as people over 75, over 65, but there are more and more reasons to push this barrier farther up, to postpone it and to consider that elderly are above 70 or 75 or whatever. So this is the first big development, the demographic change, the demographic aging of societies. The second one is technological change and the future of work, the impact on the future of work. And here we have it's less certain because it's more speculative, let's call it this way, but we already have seen what are the consequences for labor markets and for workers, for employees. The increasing use of information technologies and rise of artificial intelligence is likely to hollow out the middle jobs. So it's not that robots or some kind of automates are going to take over all kinds of jobs, but there is a vulnerable, the most vulnerable part of jobs on the labor market, which is already now disappearing. And those are jobs which for a long time were believed to require a certain, perhaps not very high, but quite specialized set of skills. Think of travel agents, bank clerks, and so on and so on. So like things which were mostly mental, which are very easy to be converted into algorithms, and which already now, by being a consumer, by buying goods of services, we all do contribute to this job distraction. Because those days we don't go to a travel agent to buy a plane ticket. We do it from our mobile or our PC at home or in the office. Yeah. So this hollowing out of the middle jobs means that the shape of society is changing, because we have increasing, at least in some countries like Ireland, increasing share of high-skilled jobs which require more sophisticated skills than simply running like a system or issuing tickets or doing similar kind of things. And at the same time, there is also increasing share of low-skilled jobs which are more difficult to be automated, and also because they pay less, there is a lesser economic stimulus to automate them. So like creating a robot to collect garbage and replace a person who collects garbage would be, it's much less profitable than creating an algorithm which will make a bank clerk or insurance agent redundant. So this is the second big trend, and obviously it will have an impact on all European societies in the next 5 years. And the third one is climate change, where we know that it is happening. We know that temperatures are rising. We can be pretty sure that a rise of global temperatures will lead to melting of ice caps, but this is basically everything that we know. We don't know, it is pretty much, it is known unknown. So we don't know what exactly will it mean for societies, for people living in different areas, how will it develop, and what will be the practical impact of global warming. And obviously those three areas are interconnected. So climate change is likely to increase the migration pressures on Europe. There is quite a lot of convincing research saying that the crisis from Syria was caused by drought, which happened there for the 3 years before the breakout of the civil war. We can expect that the push factors for migration towards Europe will remain strong. There will be also some kind of pull factor to Europe, because with aging societies we'll need more people to work in those not necessarily high-skilled jobs to provide services for the aging society. But what will be whether those two forces will balance each other ideally is very unlikely. So, and if they will not balance, but in some way they will magnify the stress of each other, then we can expect that this will have also an impact on, it will have an impact on our societies. It will have an impact on our politics, because those societies are democratic. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. There's a few seats Sorry, there's a few seats up here if anybody wants them. There's about 10, so if anybody wants to come up and sit, please do.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Denise, and thanks, Stefan, for that really good overview of some of the big macroeconomic changes that we face as a society. And I think the key question for people in this room is what those trends mean for our sector and for the people that we serve. I think there's a number of things. I think it's what they mean in terms of the challenges and opportunities for us, and then also how we as a sector can provide leadership in dealing with some of those issues, like the challenges that arise in terms of displacement from AI, the challenges that climate change presents for our society, the ageing population. I suppose to start with how we can offer leadership, I mean, I think our sector has an incredibly strong track record in leading social change and providing vital public services that people simply wouldn't get without the people in this room and the leadership that's provided by all of the different organisations represented here. We also have such a strong track record as a sector in tackling inequality, in standing up for people who need a voice, in delivering change like this. We've seen in most recent years, Denise mentioned the marriage equality referendum, also the referendum on repealing the 8th Amendment, all things that were huge civic society campaigns, to referenda that wouldn't have even happened in the first place if there wasn't a huge civic push and huge pressure on our political system to even give people the opportunity to vote on those issues, let alone campaign for them. And I think even when you see that climate change is now an issue in this week's elections, I think is amazing, and it's great to finally see that issue being taken on by politicians of all shades, not just the Green Party, who've obviously been championing it for a long time, but all politicians being asked about that issue in debates. And again, that comes from the strong environmental activism of environmental charities. And I think the whole point of our sector is that we're change makers. It's the whole point of the NGO sector. If government was doing everything right and showing the vision and the leadership, we wouldn't have a role. And I think the key question for us is how we continue to have that vision, how we respond to emerging challenges and lead positive change in the years ahead. And there's no doubt that we face major challenges. I mean, I think everybody in this room, probably the one thing certain that I lose sleep over, and I'm sure yourselves, is money, it's resources. I'm privileged to work for the Irish Cancer Society. We've an incredible team. We've over 200 nurses. The services are fantastic. I've great people making sure they're run in a professional way. The thing that I lose sleep over is knowing whether we're going to have enough money to pay for them or not, worrying about whether it's going to rain on Daffodil Day, or last year when it looked like it was going to snow on Daffodil Day. I think that's the big challenge for all of us, and it's just becoming a bigger challenge, particularly for those of us who work with older populations. Cancer is primarily a disease of older people. It can affect people at any age, but it's particularly more prevalent amongst older populations. So that ageing population presents big challenges for service providers like ourselves. And other challenges in the fundraising area are things the Cashless Society has mentioned here, the fact that we rely on street collections and increasingly people don't have any change. Crowdfunding now for individual causes, people raising money for individual causes rather than contributing to charity, I think is also means that there's increasing competition. The challenges of maximising the benefits of tech, of course, it presents challenges for us, but I think there's also enormous potential for us to reach more people than ever before if we can use technology properly. But I think in order to succeed and to meet these challenges, we need to innovate. We need to look at what we're doing and figure out how we can do it better. And I'm currently working on our new 5-year strategy at the Irish Cancer Society, and we're looking at all of our programs and seeing where we can have the greatest impact, making choices around what kind of work we should and shouldn't do going forward. They can be difficult choices, but I think we have to challenge ourselves on those things. Everything that we do is good and helps someone, but we have to evaluate and make sure that we're putting resources into the right place, and that's an ongoing, I think, challenge. Having the right kind of leadership in organisations as well to deliver change, I think is really important, that we're moving from, if you look at the world of work outside, in the private sector, organisations moving away from a kind of command and control model where instructions come down from the top and then people are expected to just deliver them, into a more innovative way of working where people are empowered at all levels to try new things. to try and fail sometimes, but learn. And I think that's key to making sure that we innovate and bring in new services and find new ways of working, which can be very challenging in such a regulated environment, or an environment where many of the organisations in this room are reliant on restricted funding, so you don't have that flexibility. And I think that's a big challenge, is how we can work with our funding providers to give us the flexibility to be able to do new things and drive things forward. I think having the right culture is really important as well, fostering curiosity within our organisations, having idea pathways where people are able to, if they have a good idea, that they're able to go ahead and try it and have flexibility at a local level to do things differently. I think increasingly we'll see hopefully more customer co-creation as well, in the way that you're seeing, say, in the tech companies where you're working with, so from our point of view as a patient organisation, working with patients to design services with them, not just for them. And I think that's really important to make sure that we're doing the right things. I think diversity is an increasing challenge. Stefan mentioned the changing age profile of our population. We also have a changing profile in terms of more people living in Ireland who weren't born here, and how we respond to that, and how we make sure not only that we're representative as an organisation in campaigning and representing people and the issues that affect them, but also that we're genuinely inclusive. And that we're inclusive in terms of our staff, our leadership roles. And I think that's probably, there's a challenge in this room, I think, maybe on that as well, in making sure that we're generally representative of the broader population. And in volunteering, that we're getting more people from diverse communities involved in our organisations as staff and volunteers. I think another key opportunity is for us to collaborate as organisations. That's why I think events like this are great, and the work that the Wheel does in bringing together different charities, large and small, different sectors, to learn from each other. And I think we need to work together stronger to defend our sector, to sell the benefits of our sector to the public. It's been a really tough few years. Yes, you were promising.
So the Spice Girls heard Stefan, and they're coming to do a little sound check. So we may decide to keep going, or we may decide to dance through it. We'll keep going for the moment, but we may have to, so keep going for the moment.
So
2 minutes left.
It's been a challenging few years, and obviously we all have to work hard to build trust, and to be more transparent about how we work, and make sure that people trust us as individual organisations and also as a sector, and to proactively sell what we do and be proud of what we do and the difference that we make in Irish society. I think there are also, that's a lot of challenges. I think there are also many opportunities. I mentioned from technology. I've just come from a health summit where one of the key themes was e-health and the opportunities that it offers for not only for patients going through treatment, having more information about what's happening and their options, but also for all of us being well and taking advantage of wearables. And Denise is wearing my Apple Watch. But the opportunities that things like wearables and other technology have for giving people data about their own health, sharing it with their physicians, reaching people in geographically difficult regions, e-consultations, all of that. I think there's enormous potential there as well. I also think there's a lot of potential in the growth of social activism, as I mentioned, with things like marriage equality and the referendum on repealing the 8th. I think particularly there's, amongst the younger generations, a real appetite and an impatience, a really wonderful impatience for delivering change. And I think that presents a great opportunity for our sector to get people involved, channel that energy, and deliver the same kind of incredible positive social change in the future as we have in the past.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll just keep going.
Yeah, got that. Yes, I'll be brief so Charles can speak before we have to vacate. Anyway, I'm Shana Cohen, and I'm the director of TASC. And for those of you who don't know, TASC is an independent think tank that engages in research and public education about inequality and democracy here in Ireland and in the EU. And thank you for inviting me. So I was asked to talk about the big socioeconomic trends that are shaping Irish society and their impact on nonprofits. And I'm going to echo things that have been said previously. I'd say, in my view, that the big challenge is actually that Ireland is facing a combination of increasingly complex problems without enough urgency and vision and policy. So I'd say that that is the challenge for nonprofits, but it's also the opportunity in the sense that nonprofits can provide that urgency and they can provide the vision. And just making a pitch for TASC, I think that the research base is important. The evidence is important for nonprofits to show that this is actually what works. We've tested it in the field, and these are the trends, and so you should listen to us, and at the same time, you should fund us, because certainly that is an issue. And just to give you an example that you're all very familiar with, but I can draw upon our own research at TASC, Charleton. It's an elaborate, detailed set of recommendations. In our own research, we found, and it was reported widely in the media, this twilight zone of people who don't qualify for the medical card because they make too much money, but they don't make enough money to access, they can't afford private health insurance, or they can't access it through their company. So they make decisions. In our research, we found they end up making decisions, well, do I go to work sick because I can't really afford to miss the day because I won't get paid for it if they're in a precarious work situation, or I just don't want to pay the 65 euros to access the GP who's going to see me for 15 minutes. It's not a functional health system, yet there's not enough urgency to change it. And the thing that I've noticed in like reading, I follow politics, as we all do, politics in France, been following the Gilets jaunes. The thing that what I've noticed is everybody said we liked Mitterrand because Mitterrand changed our lives. He gave us an extra week off of work, and we noticed the improvement in our life. Now, where is the improvement coming from previous French governments or the French government now? Now, that Ireland may have escaped the issues that are the trends in the rest of Europe, but that doesn't mean people aren't noticing that the government isn't affecting their lives in a good way, and that actually is the most urgent challenge for all of us, but particularly the nonprofit sector. So on that, I would say from our research at TASC, the greatest challenge for nonprofits is the inequality rate here. Ireland has an average market inequality rate, but it's only the consequence of cash transfers to the bottom 40%. So for all of you, if you're dealing with beneficiaries that are lower income, they're dependent upon cash transfers from the government in order to stay above poverty or to feel any kind of sense of financial security. And Ireland is an outlier in the EU. In the EU 15, and particularly among small open economies like Sweden, in how much that population, the bottom 40%, depends upon cash transfers to remain above the poverty line. And that is in the context of not having access to free, high-quality public services. So on the other side of that, the top 10% gets about 25% of the income. But we have a project on the top 10% in the EU. And of the countries we're working with, which is Sweden, Ireland, the UK, and Spain, the top 10% in Ireland feels the most insecure about its financial situation, particularly because of housing. So you have both the bottom 40% and the top 10% unhappy, and that's not a good situation. So in addition to the economic precarity, you also have, as everybody I'm sure in this room really knows, a rising cost of living in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, and that's because of housing costs, but also in general. And that it's risen significantly over the past few years. What we're finding in another project is a dramatic increase in household debt, and again among the bottom 40%, and particularly among working families. So when we found in our research, and we found in EU Silk data, which some of you may know, in 2017, low-income households are in the bottom 40%, reported that 71% could not save on a regular basis. And 12% of these households had to go into debt in the last 12 months to meet only ordinary living expenses, which is paying the rent or paying for food or paying utility bills. Now, increasingly, these are people in work. So 41% of employed respondents claimed they were unable to save income regularly. Of all the respondents who said they were in arrears for any household payment type in the last 12 months, 47% were working. So you have people who are in work who can't pay their rent. 76% of the respondents who are in work with debt stated that the burden of repayments was heavy or somewhat heavy. So you have a population that is increasingly in a desperate or precarious financial position that they're dealing with basic needs. It's not luxuries, it's basic needs. So if you have, if you have a top 10% that's facing a housing problem because they can't afford it, but the top 10% is above 70,000, but you have the bottom 40%, which is an increasingly precarious position. It presents a challenge to nonprofits because those are the beneficiaries. If they can't turn to the state for aid, then they'll turn to nonprofits. And beyond the internal problems or internal policy issues that Ireland is facing, going back to the EU and our European elections, today the UK is as y'all probably know, is having its unanticipated European parliamentary elections. Yes, exactly. So it's even mention the word Brexit. But if you mention the word Brexit, you know that it's a total catastrophe. Well, it's not a good thing for Ireland, but it's also.
I'm not sure it's a good thing for England either. I was wondering how long it was going to be something.
I'm actually British.
Shall I apologise for Brexit now?
I'm actually a British citizen, so I can. My husband's English. Anyway,
I'm going to declare I voted for Remain and remain there.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
okay, so.
Anyway, carry on.
Okay, just moving on. So Brexit, the effect of Brexit in the economy, particularly the agricultural sector, but just in general, that will exacerbate issues. Plus, if in the European parliamentary elections, the makeup changes, you could see allocation of funding from the EU change. For instance, if there's a stronger far-right bloc. Lastly, going back to climate change, as you know, Ireland's about to miss its target next year for 2020, and it'll have to pay 150 million euros, which could have been spent on the nonprofit sector. So all of these challenges together present obstacles, but also opportunities for the nonprofits. And I'll end with that. Yes, funding might be an issue in the future, but there also could be opportunities considering the crises that Europe is facing. Demand for services may become more complex. You may see people who have, and that was my experience in the UK because I came from there before I came to Ireland, where you see people because of the cuts in the public sector, and you may know this much better than I do. Their problems are increasingly complex. It's housing, mental health, hunger, which I don't think that Ireland is experiencing nearly on the scale of the UK. And then clothing for their kids. So you have people who don't have, they have problems across every aspect of their life. We have a health inequalities project, and we found, just to give you an example, people who have multiple diagnoses, let's say autism and depression, and they get passed between different agencies because comorbidity isn't recognized by in the HSE. So they can't access services anywhere. Where are they going to go to? They're going to go to a nonprofit. And at least my experience in the UK is with public services, if you can't tick a box with that particular person, then it's easier to say, go visit this charity, because they'll accommodate your needs rather than accommodate them necessarily for all of their needs in the public sector. But to finish, at a time when the civil society is facing a threat in the European Union, I'd say particularly if you look at Orban in Hungary, where they're challenging the autonomy and funding of civil society organizations. They don't like the critique of their policies, and they're threatened by the values, perhaps, that civil society represents. It's also an opportunity to work together and to think, well, together we do represent these values and we want to protect them. And I think, again, making a pitch for evidence, that it's good if you work together and collaborate and you draw upon evidence to say this works and this is what will make a positive impact in your life, then it is an opportunity for Irish and European nonprofits, I think, to move forward. And I'll end there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK, but having listened to the first session this morning, I suspect the challenges that we're facing are exactly the same that you're facing. But just to give you a little bit of perspective and background, just starting off about the number of charities that are in the UK. Does anybody want to, and I'll give you a clue, it's hundreds of thousands. Anybody want to guess how many charities there are in the UK? Somebody just pluck a figure. 300,000. And the turnover, so if you talk about how much money they spend per annum, is about 74 billion, that's sterling, so what, about 85 billion euros. Now, to put that in perspective, that is twice what the UK government spends on defence and half what we spend on the NHS. And I'll tell you why I think these are important figures. The number of trustees, there are about 1 million. The number of people volunteering once a month. Does anybody want to take a guess, either percentage of the population, so 66 million, or number of people? Does anybody just pluck a figure, somebody? 10%. 22% formally volunteer. So that's about 14 million people. And the problem that we have, I mean, I'm a trustee of 3 organizations, and what we find is that we focus very much so on the organizations that we're dealing with, but we don't look at the wider aspect of society and how important charities are. And one of the aspects that I think is the single biggest challenge, and in fact this morning's session to me just highlighted that, was, of course, we've had a massive increase, particularly since the Second World War, of the welfare state providing. And certainly in the UK between 1990 and 2010, there was probably the biggest expansion of the charity sector, and that was predominantly driven by the Blair brand government moving the welfare state out of government providing into the charity sector. And you can call it a value proposition, or you can just say that they wanted to deliver the welfare state at a more cost-effective or cheaper basis. And of course, you then had the financial crash in 2008, 9, and of course, what then happened was austerity, and suddenly, of course, government started to want to cut back funding. And of course, it wasn't central government doing it, it's local authorities, because a lot of them are distributing out to local communities. And of course, the biggest issue is that there is a huge disconnect between charities providing services into the local community and the public understanding that what is being funded by the state, which is why I think the single biggest challenge, whether it's here in Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland, or in Northern Ireland, is actually to challenge politicians and say to them, okay, fine, you need to define where the welfare state starts and charity, stops, and where charity starts. And I know that's not an easy debate to have, but the problem is that, and again, you had the regulator this morning talking about transparency. The problem is you can't have transparency until you can actually define that, in my view. So I think actually the biggest challenge and the greatest opportunity for the charity sector is actually challenging our politicians and saying to them, okay, fine, if this is an important sector, which it is, and we are doing important work, and I absolutely agree, the sector has been phenomenally innovative, and it is at the grassroots, and it is able to understand the real issues and come up with real solutions. It needs to be given that freedom. And the other thing that happened with this growth or move to expansion and a lot of funding that came from government was that organizations, particularly those that got a lot of funding, became, I use this word in the nicest possible way, but slightly lazy. Because, of course, they didn't have to go out and justify what they were doing. They were just getting it from a central source. But it also meant that they were being curtailed in some of the things that they would be doing, so not listening to their beneficiaries and being dictated from by government. And the problem that politicians have is, of course, they keep changing, and they keep changing their viewpoints of what's important and what they want to deliver. And, of course, the problem is the problems on the ground aren't changing, and they need long-term solutions rather than short-term sticking plaster, as I sort of slightly glibly describe it. And one of the areas that when I sort of talk about this, that I think is a really good case study, is if you look at the Hospice Movement. Now, the Hospice Movement was founded 40, 50 years ago, and I'm talking again about the UK, from a kitchen table from a particular individual whose husband had died from cancer, and she had been deeply dissatisfied with the care that came about. Does anybody know how much money the Hospice Movement spends in the UK? I'll give you a clue. It's in the hundreds of millions. Does anybody want to guess? Sorry? 800, very close, 900 million. So they raise about 1.4 billion, and they actually spend on hospice care about 900 million. There's no reason why you should know. Now, the funding from government to the Hospice Movement is somewhere between 25 and 35% for adult hospice. For children's hospice, it's about 15%. Now, if you go out and ask the general public how much money the Hospice Movement is getting from government, they'll probably say to you 0. But the thing I would say to you is that if the Hospice Movement didn't exist, then what would happen? And the answer is very simple. The NHS would have to provide. And then if you ask the question is, would the NHS be able to provide in the same way that the Hospice Movement has provided? And the answer very simply is no. I mean, this has been a phenomenal success story, but also the innovation that's happened with the hospice movement. I mean, I've been connected with it for the last sort of 25 years. 25 years ago, it was very much so providing care in hospices. But actually, that's not what their beneficiaries wanted. Their beneficiaries wanted to die at home, and they wanted to have adequate care. So what does the hospice movement do? It doesn't sort of sit and think about it and then do nothing. It actually provides that. So you've seen this massive shift, and it's happened because people have been making decisions on the ground. So I think, so the first thing I would just say to you is that I suppose the big point is that I think we actually need to push back. I think we need to think about the way that we are communicating what we are doing and the important work it is. But I think we need to do it not just from the organizations we work for. I think we need to do it from a bigger picture basis. The other big change I think that has happened, and I think you've been very fortunate with your regulator, but certainly the Charity Commission has changed dramatically, and there was a very good reason for that there was a very damning report in 2012 where they were effectively described as not fit for purpose. And they have very much so become an intrusive regulator. But the problem with regulation is the more regulation you put, the less people are likely to innovate, the less people are likely to risk. And I think there is a very fine balance there. The problem is that every time you have a scandal, and we've had a fair few in the charity sector, so you've had Kids Company, you have had Olive Cook, who was this lady who committed suicide, who'd received about 3,000 communications from charities in a single year. You've had safeguarding with Oxfam and a number of the international NGOs. And so, and you've also had a number of charity organizations who were fined around data protection. 2 minutes, oh gosh, I've been chattering on. So, but the one thing I will say to you is the charity sector in every instance has embraced that scandal and has been proactive in making sure that they've ended up doing the right thing. So I think we need to be very careful about how we regulate the sector so that we don't kill innovation.
Great, thank you very much. So now you all know what slowbalisation to a cashless society means. So look, we've had a really interesting input from all our panellists, and just some of the things that struck me: changing demographics, climate change, which we're all aware of, but the implication for Ireland of that and for our sector in terms of fines, technology, the future of work, the challenge of that, but also the opportunities, regulation, the importance of it, but how it can impede on innovation, the impact of social activism that we've really seen here in Ireland. A couple of pitches there for evidence base and evidence of why we should consider that. The inequality ratio, rising cost of living and people living in debt or precarious financial situations, the top and the lower incomes really affected. The far right, a little bit of a nod to that. Brexit, the threat to civil society, complexity of the issues that we're trying to respond to. So they were just some of the things that I heard, and I'm sure you heard other things as well as you were listening. We're going to open it to the floor now. So if anybody wants to make a comment, an observation, a question, you might just say your name and if you're with an organisation. We'll take a few rounds and then we'll go back to the panel. Anybody got anything they'd like to add to that long list? Or any solutions that they'd like to offer? It's the excitement of the Spice Girls, I think. Here we go.
Just to get in the absence of any other questions. I suppose one question for me, I come from DOCA, so work in the international development sphere, and the one thing that we're challenged by is this seeming kind of breakdown of multilateralism. This idea that you can negotiate your way out of some of these complex challenges through a multilateral system that believes in consensus, and you're really feeling that is breaking down now into more kind of bilateral wheelings and dealings behind closed doors. I wonder if there's a sense of that from where you sit, and of course what the implications are for Ireland. Thanks.
Any other questions, observations? Great, thanks a million. Gentleman there in the middle.
Thank you. Michael Higgins from St. Vincent de Paul. There was a mention of advocacy in the previous session and again here, and I'm just curious the panelists' thoughts on the emphasis that should be put on advocacy towards politicians versus the general public, because my sense of it is that politicians will vote with their constituents' perspective. So, for example, we all agree more social housing should be built, but just not in my backyard. We'll all agree that climate change is important, but we may not be willing to pay a carbon tax, for example. So I just wonder, in terms of civil society, do the panelists have a sense of the percentage emphasis they should put on appealing to the general public as opposed to directly to politicians? Thank you.
Okay, we'll go back to the panel. I'll start with you, Stefan.
Wow. So on the last question, just before lunch, there was another session which I listened to that was on the making. The title was "Making Civil Society Voice Well Heard." That was not that easy because they were already rehearsing outside. That one of the important topics there was financing of politics. And, well, obviously there is an issue of politicians being accountable to their electorate and paying attention to what people in their constituency think, which makes basically a good case to influence both citizens, meaning voters, and politicians. But also it shows the other side of the coin, because they also need money to campaign in the election. And in the case which you gave, the social housing, obviously there is a trade-off, because the more social housing is built, the lesser market for commercial housing. And so this, this might sound well. And here, don't quote me on that. It is like my personal reaction to what you said. That, well, politicians have very many factors they need to take in their policy making. So obviously, influencing, speaking to them that this is important makes sense, but perhaps it is more efficient if there is like a common belief among the constituents that this is what they want their politicians to deliver, because this in the end might be more convincing argument than simply than only providing evidence that social housing is good.
Okay, Averil, you want to back in that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Michael, in relation to advocacy. And I'd say from my own perspective, both as now working as a charity leader, but having been a senator, and I worked as a government advisor before that, is the most effective campaigns are the ones that combine the local and the national. You're bringing forward national arguments and you have the evidence base to show why something needs to change. But the reality is in our political system, many of our politicians are more responsive to the local. And you'll get a lot further with if you get 20 registered voters to approach a TD and talk about and as constituents, you'll get further than thousands of people standing outside Leinster House. Because our constituencies in this country often come down to a handful of seats. People are very conscious that they could win or lose their seat by a handful of votes. And when you have people actually contacting them and saying, I'm a registered voter in your constituency, going to their clinics, Marriage Equality had a great campaign called Out to Your TD, where they had people going and talking directly to TDs at clinics, sharing their personal stories. I think humanising issues as well is really important. I think all of us as individuals, whether you're ordinary members of society, politicians, leaders, we respond more to personal stories often than to statistics. We've saw that with that poor boy washed up in the beach, and suddenly I suppose what's happening in Syria really hit people's consciousness, and before that you thousands, hundreds of thousands of people affected by that crisis, hundreds of thousands of families getting on those boats and risking their lives and people dying. But it was when you were able to see one little boy and think, that could be my son, that could be my grandson, that that people really related to that and demanded change. We've seen the same here with homelessness. people dying in our streets, of homelessness, of other issues. I think it really hits home when it's personal. And I think sharing those personal stories directly to public representatives makes a difference, provided it's also backed up with an evidence base and solutions. You'll be much more effective in your lobbying if, instead of shouting at politicians about what's wrong, you're able to show them what's right and what works, and make a coherent argument. Whether you're in Leinster House or in the local councils, people are getting, every group is onto you all the time, and people are telling you all the things that are wrong. When you get groups that are really good at coming in and pointing out solutions, they've got things that are costed, they can show that they've piloted something that actually works, you'll get a lot further. But with politicians and with the civil servants, when you're coming forward with solutions rather than just with problems, that's not to say that always works and that politics is rational, because unfortunately it's not, but that's why you also need the political push at the local level as well, the national evidence base and the political push too.
Great.
Just briefly, I would say that just from a think tank perspective, that housing is an issue that relates to different audiences. So, I mean, I've talked to somebody from the American Chamber of Commerce, and he said our problem in attracting employers here is that there's no housing available for, like, to bring somebody for Intel or Google. I've heard IBEX say the same thing. So they want a housing market for their potential employees from Europe or the United States or wherever. And then you have rural farmers saying, we are tired of people who have second homes out here who only come out 1 month a year. We want some sort of tax on housing. And then you have social housing. So I think from a policy perspective, you want to avoid stigmatizing housing as an issue that is associated with poor people, that instead it's housing in general is a problem. And then from a local perspective, I agree completely. You have a national strategy, but then you're pushing locally for different interests, and that's the way to go about it. Just to go back to the bilateral issue, I think that just from my own background as an American, I would say that Ireland is in a situation, they're kind of in a bind because they have the relationship with the EU, and then they have the relationship with the US, which is a bit unstable, but they're very dependent on American investment, and they're very dependent on the survival of those big companies like Facebook, which is a bit in trouble. So that's not the most reliable industrial policy. I'd say that it maybe needs a rethink in some ways. Just forget the corporate tax rate. It's the relationship with the U.S. and trade, especially if Trump is reelected as president. And then there'll be a separate relationship with the UK post-Brexit, if there ever is a Brexit, and that will be another bilateral relationship that Ireland will have to work out. So I think its trade relations will become more complex. I hate to keep using that word, but and that will affect, at some indirect level, I think overseas aid or relationships with. There may not be any space for the global South.
Yeah, I think it's. I think as a sector, I think we've not been as good at. I don't talk about advocacy. I talk about messaging. So it's making sure that the messages are simple and they're clear. I mean, there is no doubt about it. Over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a huge decline in public trust and confidence, not in the charity sector specifically, but across society as a whole, whether it's business, whether it's politicians, everything. There has just been a massive decline. The other thing I thought was really interesting is what's happening in the younger generation. So the fastest growing area of volunteering is happening between 16 and 21. And one of the things, and I have to say I'm sadly over 50, that's probably grey hair shows, but it's, so I've got a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I'm trying to understand actually how they communicate and what's important to them. And there does seem to me a big trend towards wanting to do something to society, and it's important to them. And I think that we need to work out how we engage with them. So just to give you one very quick example, one of the things I hear regularly from charities is they find it difficult to get trustees, and particularly younger trustees. And I came up with an idea 2 or 3 years ago, and I've tested it out with 3 people, so it's a very small test. But actually, no, it's been great, but it's been phenomenally successful, of having shadow or apprentice trustees. So when I went out to talk to 25, 26-year-olds, most of them said to me, we'd love to be trustees, but we don't really know what the responsibility is. We're a bit fearful of it, and we don't know whether we've got the time to do it. And I've done it with 3 people where they've effectively attended all the board meetings, they get all the papers, they have an equal voice. In fact, I generally forget they're shadow trustees. The only thing is they don't have the responsibility, and technically they don't vote. And actually one of them has just become a trustee of one of the charities I'm on, and she has been absolutely brilliant with the energy and enthusiasm that she's brought onto it. So, I think there is a fantastic opportunity to do stuff in that, but I actually think we need to engage with them and we need to go out and talk to them. And it's doing it in different ways. I mean, I just look at my 16 and 13-year-old. I mean, they spend an awful lot of time on gadgets. I worry enormously about what the impact of that is. But actually, their communities that they are talking to are much more diverse than they were when I was growing up, because, of course, I didn't have those things and it was very much so local. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, and I can't work out whether it's a bad or a good thing, but actually I just look at it as a different way of doing stuff and actually how important that is. And we need to look at that and see how we can tap into that.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Last chance. Okay, so I want to thank our panel for their contribution. Thank all of you. I think we're going down now as our esteemed Taoiseach is coming to talk to us all. Also like to wish everybody well in our local and European elections tomorrow. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you to our panel.